When 17-year-old black teenager Darius Wynn stepped into the courtroom that morning, he still believed justice was real. He had never committed a crime, wasn't even at the scene, and the evidence against him, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than blurry footage and conflicting testimonies. But Darius still believed, like so many good kids raised in poverty, that truth would eventually speak. Just a few feet behind him, his mother, Mrs. Evelyn Wynn, sat silently. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages of her worn Bible, her lips moving in endless prayer. She had believed in God her whole life, but this morning she prayed harder than ever before. The court-appointed attorney leaned over and whispered to Darius, "We're good. Weak case. You'll walk." But Darius's eyes said otherwise. He had heard of Judge Ronald Garrison, a man infamous for handing out harsh sentences to black youth. And the moment Garrison entered the courtroom, the air thickened like a heavy curtain dropping over the last flicker of hope. Garrison looked straight at Darius, his eyes cold as steel. No preamble. No hint of leniency. "Boys like you," he said, each word slicing through the room, "are a danger to this society. I'm tired of watching people like you destroy everything good that decent men have built." In that moment, justice didn't just fall silent, it was suffocated. And only a few minutes later, the entire courtroom froze as the judge delivered his sentence: life in prison, no parole. The gavel crashed down, thundering through the room like a winter storm. Darius's mother collapsed. Her Bible slipped from her hands, pages flaring across the cold courtroom floor. The room filled with gasps, stifled sobs, and furious whispers. But Judge Garrison didn't flinch. He turned away and walked out as if ending an administrative hearing, not a boy's life. Darius didn't move. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But his eyes were hollow, as if someone had drained the soul from his body. A police officer stepped forward and fastened cold steel cuffs around his wrists. The world around Darius twisted, distant, and warped like he was sinking underwater. His friends shouted. His lawyer protested loudly. But every sound felt muted, echoing in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. As they led him away, Darius finally looked up for the first time since the verdict and spoke so softly the officer had to lean in to hear. "Can I make a phone call?" The officer hesitated, but something in Darius's eyes stopped him from saying no. They led him to a side room and handed him a phone. Darius took a deep breath and dialed the number he had never forgotten, though he rarely dared use it. 1 ring, 2. Then a deep, steady voice answered, calm but sharp as ice. "Speak." Darius swallowed hard. His voice cracked like a frayed wire. "Dad, it happened." On the other end of the line, the silence lasted only a few seconds, but to Darius, it felt like a lifetime. He didn't hear breathing. No comforting words came. But then that voice returned calm, as still water yet charged like a gathering storm. "I'm on my way." No reassurance, no consolation, just 4 words. And yet for the shackled boy, they were enough to let him finally close his eyes and breathe for the first time that day. No one in that courtroom, no one in that building full of tension and injustice knew what they had just done. They hadn't sentenced some nameless teen. They had sentenced the son of Jonathan Wynn, the Attorney General of the United States, the top of the federal justice system, a man who could launch national investigations with a single signature. And before dawn could rise, 3 black federal SUVs with government plates rolled up in front of the Chicago District Courthouse. Federal marshals fanned out like a wave. The main entrance locked down. Reporters swarmed like bees. Flashes, microphones, chaos. But when the doors opened and Jonathan Wynn stepped out, the crowd went silent. No body armor. No weapons. Just a gaze sharp as a blade and a voice that didn't need to shout to command a room. He had not come to plead. He had come to reclaim. And the battle wasn't just for his son. It was for every child wrongly judged by a system too afraid to see the truth. No knock, no announcement. Jonathan Wynne. The United States Attorney General pushed open the office door of Judge Ronald Garrison with enough force to tilt the coffee cup on the desk. The air still reeked of distorted law and scorched morality. Garrison looked up, forcing a polite smile that couldn't quite mask his nerves. His hand flicked through papers as if searching for a reason to exist. "Attorney General Wynne, didn't expect you in Chicago so soon." Jonathan didn't respond. He walked straight to the desk and dropped a thick federal dossier onto the polished wood with a thud that snapped the room's pretense in half. "Yesterday you sentenced my son." Garrison's throat bobbed. His fingers trembled as he flipped through files. "The boy, Darius. The boy you buried under a life sentence like he was trash." Jonathan replied, each word striking like a nail into rotted wood. The room froze. "I didn't know," Garrison stammered. "No, you didn't. Because you didn't care to ask." Jonathan's voice was low, but every syllable cut like a scalpel. He slid the folder closer. "I watched every second of that trial. You dismissed exculpatory evidence. You silenced the defense attorney. You delivered a sentence shaped by bias, not by the law." Garrison tried to hold ground. "With all due respect, this isn't federal jurisdiction." Jonathan leaned in his stare, drilling deep. "It is now." That same afternoon, the Department of Justice issued an emergency federal order. A special investigation task force was activated. Within 12 hours, the Chicago District Courthouse, once a symbol of local judicial power, became the epicenter of a national reckoning. Live broadcasts, protests surging at the courthouse steps, signs screaming justice for Darius. But Jonathan Wynne knew this wasn't just about a wrongful verdict. He wasn't fighting for one boy. He was pulling the mask off a system rotten to its core. Confidential reports began to surface. Chilling details emerged. Bribes from private prison contractors. Police falsifying witness statements. Judges, including Garrison, suspected of issuing high sentence quotas in exchange for stock incentives. And Darius just a sacrificial pawn, an easy conviction to meet the end-of-quarter metrics. Jonathan's fingers froze over a familiar name in a statement: Officer Mitchell Green, the man who swore Darius was at the scene. What Jonathan uncovered chilled him. Green was the brother-in-law of the deputy director of a private prison company that had just secured multi-million-dollar expansion contracts. One sentence. One lie, and a tangled web of power and profit hidden beneath it all. Jonathan gripped the file tighter. His eyes no longer belonged to a grieving father. They belonged to a man ready to flip the entire table. While the media lights still blazed outside the courthouse, darkness had already begun to shift in silence. Jonathan Wynne, the man who once stood before Congress to champion legal transparency, now found himself becoming a target. It started small, almost dismissible, a midnight anonymous call with nothing but slow, heavy breathing. A handwritten letter, no return address, containing only one sentence: "Step back, if you want to make it home alive." Then things escalated. His armored government-issued SUV had its brake lines cut. The office of one of his senior investigators caught fire just 1 hour after accessing the financial records of the district court. Jonathan said nothing to the press, but inside he knew the war was no longer confined to the courtroom. Inside the state prison, Darius was fighting a silent war of his own. He was no longer just an anonymous inmate. Some called him a symbol. Others saw him as a threat, or worse, a target to eliminate. One night, his cell door was mysteriously left unlocked. A food tray was delivered, but a fellow inmate whispered, "Don't touch it." Darius didn't break. He learned to move quietly, to listen, to watch. Older inmates, men who had been wrongfully imprisoned for decades, began to protect him, to teach him how to survive. Outside, Jonathan scribbled a single line in his journal: "I'm not fighting for fame. I'm fighting for that boy, the son I never got to teach how to believe in justice, because I thought this society would do it for me." On the day of the appeal trial, America held its breath. Outside the federal courthouse, hundreds of journalists crowded beneath bold red banners. "Justice is not a privilege. Free Darius Wynn." Jonathan Wynn entered the courtroom in a simple black suit, but the air he carried with him was that of a man who had nothing left to lose except the truth. Evidence was presented. Witnesses were recalled. The entire courtroom fell into pin-drop silence as Officer Mitchell Green, the man who had testified against Darius, was called to the stand. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He simply placed a photograph before the Officer Green, shaking hands with his own brother-in-law, the CEO of the private prison system. And as people realized that every unusually long prison sentence translated into massive profits, the room erupted. An investigator read aloud a damning report. Every month, Judge Garrison received incentives from a subsidiary of a private prison conglomerate. At least 32 black teenagers had been excessively sentenced in just the past 18 months with insufficient evidence. Multiple police officers had staged crime scenes and coerced witnesses. The nation ignited. State after state announced full audits of their judicial systems. Dozens of civil rights groups called for a nationwide independent investigation. Finally, the federal judge presiding over the appeal ordered the immediate release of Darius Wynn, calling the original sentence a crime disguised as justice. Darius walked out of his cell to the thunder of applause. His mother wept. Jonathan embraced his son not as the Attorney General, but as a father. On the day Darius Wynn was released, the press captured the moment he stepped out of the prison gates, thin, but head held high amid roaring cheers. He said nothing, but his eyes that had seen the depths of darkness and now looked into the light spoke for the millions who had been forgotten by the system. Jonathan Wynn, usually a stoic Attorney General, shed tears that day, not out of triumph, but because his son was alive to keep walking forward. Not long after, a national movement began, not from a high office, but from a modest podium in a public high school where Darius gave his first speech. Father and son, 2 generations, 2 roles, one mission began a journey across America. They visited community halls, universities, and policy hearings, and everywhere Darius said one simple truth: justice is not something handed down. It's something we must rise and fight for again and again. Change didn't come overnight, but the wave began. Over 20 states reopened appellate cases involving minority teens. Contracts with private prison firms were canceled. A series of juvenile sentencing reforms was introduced in the Senate. Darius had once been a defendant. Now he was a symbol. Jonathan had once been the guardian of the system. Now he was the one demanding it be rebuilt. Together they no longer walked as victims, but as the ones rewriting the rules. One cold autumn night, in the dim light of his DOJ office, Jonathan Wynn opened the final folder of the day. Inside, among familiar documents, was an envelope. No postage, no sender, just a single handwritten line: "For you, and only you." Jonathan sat upright. His fingers tightened around the paper, instinctively sensing danger. Inside was a blurred photograph. A man shaking hands with a group of officials, all of whom Jonathan had helped expose in previous investigations. On the back, written in blood-red ink, "I built this system. And you can't touch me." Jonathan sat still for a long time. This wasn't Garrison, not Officer Green, not a single corrupt actor. This was deeper, an unseen hand behind it all. Someone who had constructed a network of quotas, kickbacks, and corrupt rulings, running the system like a machine, one that didn't care who it crushed. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart, Darius. His son answered, calm as ever. "Something wrong." "Dad." Jonathan gently gripped the photo. His voice was quiet but heavy with resolve. "There's someone else. Higher, older, more dangerous." Darius didn't hesitate. "Then we keep going. Together. Because some battles don't end with a verdict. Justice isn't granted because people scream. It's because someone quietly never gives up." The next morning, Jonathan and Darius sat across from each other at a roadside cafe. No cameras, no legal advisors, no media pressure. Just a father and a son sharing a rare moment of peace in the storm of justice. Jonathan pulled the photo from his jacket pocket. He laid it on the table, then looked at his son, his eyes heavy but full of fire. "When I was young, I believed that if I was right enough, the system would fix itself. But now I know some things don't fix themselves. They have to be shaken." Darius smiled. Not a victorious smile, but the smile of someone who had learned the road would never be easy, but he'd never walk it alone. "Dad, we didn't come this far to stop now." That very day they returned to Washington, but not to celebrate. To begin phase 2 of their fight. A new federal bill limiting judicial power. A proposal to ban private prison contracts nationwide. A young legal coalition to support the voiceless wrongfully convicted. The story of Darius Wynn was not just about overturning a sentence. It was proof that justice is not a gift from the throne of power. It is a promise, one that must be defended with courage, wisdom, and above all, unconditional love. If you believe that truth, even when buried, will find light, then help us write the next chapter. Subscribe now and don't miss stories that will make you cry, make you think, and make you believe again. Because justice is not a destination. It's a journey, and on that journey we never walk alone.